video is on postmodern feminism. Postmodern feminism very much draws on the work of postmodern philosophy, part of the mid-20th century postmodern movement more generally, which included all sorts of things like art, writing, philosophy, all sorts of postmodern approaches to critique, all of which were bundled up into a series of ideas that looked at basically deconstructing our understandings of the world, asking ourselves more than what the world was about, more than applying existing structures or existing concepts, but asking where we got those concepts and what they meant at an underlying level. They also took apart a lot of certainties. So asking things such as what does certain assumptions about the world, how did they come to be? How does that change over time? So, for example, Michel Foucault had a practice which he called genealogy, where he worked through different understandings of a concept over time, such as mental illness or healthcare, to show that our current understandings were incredibly socially influenced rather than something which was neutral or objective. And many of the others postmodern philosophers did similar work. Some had different foci. So Foucault was very much about looking at social institutions and institutions of power and how they came to develop to their current state. Jacques Lacan was very much about applying a framework based originally in Freudian psychoanalysis to look at the difference between what exists and what meaning society would put on that thing through the use of words and social structures, etc. Postmodern feminists drew on these ideas and very much look at things such as the social construction of ideas like sex and gender. Writers include, in particular, Judith Butler. Others, though, include Mary Jo Frugg, Bell Hooks, and many others use postmodern feminism. They very much look at ideas about the fact that even our construction of concepts such as male and female, or our idea we have binary genders, are something that is created by our society, and that other societies that are not modern Western societies may have different assumptions today or in the past. Hooks is also very much known for doing some very interesting and very important work on intersectional feminism and womanism. Please note that Bell Hooks does not capitalize the first letter of her names. There is some use of some theoretical French feminism. Some of Kristeva's work she shows in Irigaray are sometimes considered to be postmodern, though they're also often part of difference feminism or considered their own particular theoretical group. More radical or liberal writers like Steinem often critique postmodern feminism as being relatively academic, mostly obscure and inaccessible, sometimes about word games rather than making a difference on the ground in real-world political activity. But having said that, people like Butler and even some of the philosophers such as Foucault that this part of feminism has borrowed from were also activists in their own right, and so were out there marching on the streets at different times. For postmodern feminism and law, moving into areas of jurisprudence, postmodernism itself very much rejects the idea of a closed jurisprudential theory of everything. Some more traditional jurisprudences like the idea of jurisprudence as a closed system, as a system within which you can reason to the basis of law, the theoretical approaches to law, and the application of law. However, postmodern feminists and postmodernists in general would say that that is a mistake, that thinking that one can, from within law itself, find out all of the meanings and effects of law and what is the most appropriate way to do law, which is often part of the jurisprudential project, are not something that you can do. So they reject that idea of jurisprudential theories of everything. They often reject essentialism, so the certain ideas which lawyers consider to be base certainties in legal practice may be rejected by postmodernists. They also often look at mechanisms of power, particularly in, for example, Foucauldian feminists. Foucault himself did not look at law as an object of study. He saw it as a mechanism of the state's power, but he didn't actually study it as a separate mechanism of power. It was merely part of the state's power more generally for him. But Foucauldian feminists, and particularly Foucauldian feminists doing work in law, are often very interested in the way that law, through its structures, through its courts, but also through its normative influences, actually do create mechanisms of power. They will often also, postmodern feminists often borrowing on people such as Lacan, will look at the difference between things such as what he calls the signifier and the object. So once again, I use this example in some of the earlier lectures. This is my phone. So it is a thing. It is a real thing. It is an object. It is a piece of plastic and glass and circuitry, but we call it a phone. The phone is the signifier. This thing in its little like mum type cover is a we know that that's a phone because our social signifier gives it a whole bunch of meanings, and that term phone has its own meanings and its own emotional resonances, and it restricts our understanding of that thing, so that we would not say it's a paperweight, for example. We would not say that it's a building block, but it can be used as those things. But because we put meanings around it, we have a certain understanding of it. And in law, there is something very similar. We have an understanding through not only the words used, but the social meanings of certain acts and behaviours that are different from the underlying real, the objects or the actions. And postmodern feminists often like to pull apart the differences between, oh, well, here's the thing and here is the meanings we attach to the thing, which have certain effects in society and certain effects through their normative use by the legal system that then influences society and power structures in certain ways. They're particularly keen at looking at discourses of law as part of discourses creating social realities more generally, and our uses of the language of law as part of the use of language to regulate what can be known. So you may have heard sometimes people will say until you have a word for a concept, it is very hard to have the concept. So in English, we borrowed the word Schadenfreude, which I'm probably mispronouncing, from the German, that word meaning to take delight in the suffering of another. Now, we had people who would take delight in the suffering of another, but we didn't have that particular aspect of it that we have borrowed the German word for. And now that can be known, and we have a concept for it. Similarly, things such as sexual harassment did not necessarily exist as a concrete concept until radical feminists and liberal feminists brought that to the fore and named a set of behaviours using that particular term. And so law, through its use of language, has created a social signifier for a disapproved behaviour. And even further than that, by regulating that thing as something which should not happen, has created a social norm that in the last 50 to 60 years has changed the way we regard people making sexual approaches to their employees. If you watch Mad Men, it was considered relatively normal for men in power, men in the upper reaches of a company, to make sexual approaches to their female subordinates. Whereas now that is actually considered something which is both illegal, slimy and unwanted, even though of course it still does happen, as the recent horrible revelations about Dyson Hayden, a High Court judge, have shown us. But the Foucauldian feminists and the Lacanian feminists would say we can look at these discourses of law as sources of both power and of ways we can create new norms to understand the world. They tend to critique other theories of jurisprudence that seek that concept of closure. They often look at collapsing meanings of law and gender terms, how that in law and in thinking about gender, how we can again pull apart and also work together to show how the law has a hidden patriarchal agenda. Postmodern feminism, because it is always about saying, but what if, or why does this work the way it does, has been part of often moving towards intersectionality, and many postmodern feminists are very comfortable with what we cover in Module 3 around intersectionality, because it seems like an obvious part of questioning. Not only do you question the others and the law and society, but also your own movement. This move to the postmodern has also has a close alliance with a range of other areas of critical legal studies. Critical legal studies more generally is what it says on the box, critical of the law, often using postmodern frameworks, and includes things such as queer theory, critical race theory, critical disability theory, etc. And many of these also reject the essentialism of jurisprudence, and sometimes the essentialism which sometimes underlies radical and liberal feminisms around meanings of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, what it means to have gender, etc. This has led to a range of critiques because it's often seen as a series of ivory tower word games, being rather elitist and academic with very little boots on the ground application. It's often seen as relatively impractical or not practical. What does it matter if you pass the meaning of a word and look at it a million different ways if that doesn't make a difference to people, would be the critique. The postmodern feminists would respond that you have to understand what's going on before you can dismantle it. Postmodernism, because it's about pulling things to pieces often and figuring out how they work, often has little overarching organising principle. While postmodern feminists will generally agree that there is a patriarchy, that it underlies Western society, and it often underlies almost all societies for humans. However, it doesn't have a single particular approach to things in the same way that liberal feminism has its use of equality and particularly equality outside the home and in society, or radical feminism has its idea of dismantling the patriarchy. Postmodern feminism may borrow, postmodern feminists may borrow from those, but postmodern feminist itself does not have a framework which puts in place a particular desired outcome or a particular goal necessarily. Though most postmodern feminists would agree that they want to critique inequality based on gender, and they want to replace that with the removal of the patriarchy or putting in place equality, etc. But there is less focused outcome than there is in some other areas of feminism. It also lacks organising principles for issues that may in fact apply to all people of particular genders, because it can fall into ideas of, again, looking at differences, looking at signifiers, looking at the ways that, looking at the world through critique rather than necessarily looking at the world through action. And I say this as someone who does identify as a postmodern Foucauldian feminist in a lot of my analysis work that I do. But I also like to try and make a difference. So I guess I borrow from lots of different types of feminism. Bell Hooks in particular has critiqued postmodern feminism generally, even though she partakes in it as a particularly effective academic. But she also questions the idea that the postmodern deconstruction of the liberal subject has come into place just as marginalised people are actually pushing for rights as legal subjects. So pushing for rights that are the same as other small L liberal theory legal subjects in Western societies. And at the same time, we're saying, well, what is the subject? What does it mean to be a subject of a society? Is there such a thing? How do we construct it? While people are actually fighting for this very concrete, to them, term that would give them access to a better life and to a more equal access to society. So there is critique to be made of postmodern feminism. So, but having said that, the work of people in particular, such as Judith Butler, have been heavily used to grow into other areas such as queer theory and to some degree masculinities theory, as you'll see in some of the other modules of the course. So that's it for postmodern feminism.